Hi, boys and girls. So today I'm going to be reading Extra Yarn, and I honestly may have read this book already to you guys in class, but it's one of my favorites, and so I didn't want this year to go by without me reading it. So this is actually a really cool story. Um, it's a little about being kind. You know I love books about teaching people to be kind, but this little girl goes above and beyond, even when she feels a little pressure from somebody else, maybe to make a different choice. So I hope you enjoy it. We'll talk a little bit more about the lesson at the end of the story. All right. Extra Yarn by Mac Barnett, illustrated by John Klassen. On a cold afternoon in a cold little town, where everywhere you looked was either the white of snow or the black of soot from chimneys, Annabel found a box filled with yarn of every color. So she went home and knit herself a sweater. And when Annabel was done, she had some extra yarn. So she knit a sweater for Mars too. But there was still extra yarn. And when Annabel and Mars went for a walk, Nate pointed and laughed and said, "You two look ridiculous." "You're just jealous," said Annabel. "No, I'm not," said Nate. But it turned out he was. And even after she'd made a sweater for Nate and his dog, and for herself, and for Mars, she still had extra yarn. At school, Annabel's classmates could not stop talking about her sweater. "Quiet!" shouted Mr. Norman. "Quiet, everyone! Annabel, that sweater of yours is a terrible distraction. I cannot teach with everyone turning around to look at you." "Well, then I'll knit one for everyone," Annabel said, "so they won't have to turn around." "Impossible," said Mr. Norman. "You can't." But it turned out she could, and she did, even for Mr. Norman. And when she was done, Annabel still had extra yarn. So she knit sweaters for her mom and dad, and for Mr. Pendleton and Mrs. Pendleton, and for Dr. Palmer, and for little Louis. She made sweaters for everyone except Mr. Crabtree, who never wore sweaters or even long pants, and who would stand in his shorts with the snow up to his knees. "No sweater for me, thanks," said Mr. Crabtree. So she made Mr. Crabtree a hat, and even then Annabel still had extra yarn. She made sweaters for all the dogs and all the cats and for other animals too. Soon, people thought, soon Annabel will run out of yarn. But it turned out she didn't. So Annabel made sweaters for things that didn't even wear sweaters. Things began to change in that little town. News spread of this remarkable girl who never ran out of yarn, and people came to visit from around the world to see all the sweaters and to shake Annabel's hand. One day an archduke, who was very fond of clothes, sailed across the sea and demanded to see Annabel. "Little girl," said the archduke, "I would like to buy that miraculous box of yarn, and I am willing to offer you $1,000,000. "No, thank you," said Annabel, who was knitting a sweater for a pickup truck. The archduke's mustache twitched. "2,000,000, he said. Annabel shook her head. "No, thanks." "10,000,000, shouted the archduke. "Take it or leave it." "Leave it," said Annabel. "I won't sell the yarn." And she didn't. So that night the archduke hired 3 robbers to break into Annabel's house, and they stole the box, and took it to the archduke, who set off across the snow and sailed over the sea. back to his castle. The Archduke put on his favorite song and sat in his best chair. Then he took out the box and he lifted its lid and he looked inside. His mustache quivered. It shivered. It trembled. The Archduke hurled the box out the window and shouted, "Little girl, I curse you with my family's curse. You will never be happy again." But it turned out she was. So I hope you liked that book. Probably my favorite part is when Annabelle shows bravery. And the Archduke is trying to buy her magical box of yarn from her, right? And we kind of find out it's magic when it doesn't work for the Duke. And that's actually part of your writing assignment today, is to tell me, why do you think it worked for Annabelle but didn't work for the Archduke? And it made me think about intentions, and that um, that word really just means what you plan to do with something. So think about that when you think about answering that question. I love that she didn't stop. Right? She wanted to knit herself a sweater, but she didn't stop there. She's like, well, I've got extra yarn, so I'm going to keep making it. And she turns her pretty dreary town, right, with a lot of blacks and whites, and she said, all you could see is the white of the snow and the black of the roofs. She turns a pretty kind of dreary, sad-looking town into a beautiful place. And it made me have a text-to-text connection, thinking about Little Miss Rumphius from the beginning of the year, how she turned the world into a beautiful place by adding something in it and giving a little kindness to the people she saw and the people she was around. So there's our lesson right there, right? Spread a little joy, spread a little kindness, right? Make the world a little bit better, a little bit prettier. All right. Love you guys. Talk to you later. Bye.